When creating something as large as a Final Fantasy game, attention to detail is crucial. There are just so many things that have to go right in order to make the final product live up to the extreme pedigree of quality the series has become known for, and as each release in the franchise is quickly poured over by legions of fans and reviewers, not to mention that there's also an increase in scope, it is of the utmost importance that everything is in the right place. Most entries in the series are also standalone, reducing the chance for errors, but despite huge teams of QA testers, editors, and executive review processes, occasionally things do slip through the cracks, and it's precisely those little mistakes and gaffes that we're going to focus on today. Some, like Aerith's famous "This Guy Are Sick" line, are very well known amongst the fanbase, but for this video, we will hopefully be taking a closer look at some that we hope you didn't know about. We should underline note that this list is in good fun and doesn't represent any pointed criticisms of the games mentioned. Rather, this list is just to highlight some bits of trivia that you can pull out later on for fellow fans, as well as some moments we hope will genuinely make you look back and question how you interpreted some moments at the time. So, from invisible NPCs through to Cloud's seemingly endless supply of swords, let's take a look at 7 mistakes you won't believe made it into Final Fantasy titles, and we'll kick things off with Irvine and his miraculous shot. When Final Fantasy VII was released on the PlayStation, players around the world were entranced. They had never before seen such impressive set pieces that were interwoven with cutting-edge graphical presentation and immersive storytelling. When Final Fantasy VIII released, players saw Square had pushed the bar even further. From the brilliant opening cutscene through to the Dollet landing mission, the first disc felt like a non-stop roller coaster, and it set the cinematic tone that the rest of the game would follow. Its biggest set piece, the Delling City assassination, was the perfect capstone for the story up to that point, and it really captured the tense mood and gravity of the task at hand. At the climax of the sequence, Sorceress Edea found herself stuck on a float in the middle of the party's elaborate trap. Sealed between 2 gates, the group's sharpshooter and pride of Galbadia Garden, Irvine, had a clear shot at the villain. After taking the shot, Irvine unfortunately did not hit his target, but upon closer inspection, he had done something pretty spectacular, as his shot had just bent the laws of physics, even by Final Fantasy standards. Upon closer inspection, the FMV showed Irvine firing a bullet at the front of the float, but in actuality, Irvine had been firing at the back of the float, as the attempt on the sorceress's life was made from the roof of the same building her parade was moving away from. While easy to miss as the shot itself happened so fast, the orientation of Edea's float is confirmed in the second part of the sequence. When Squall jumps into the crowd and commandeers a car to engage Edea head-on, he clearly approaches the float from behind. This means that either Irvine is a much better shot than anyone in the game seems to give him credit for, or somehow this mistake made it through the thorough review process of one of the game's most memorable scenes. Now, the original Final Fantasy was a groundbreaking title for its time and offered players a fleshed out fantasy world to explore filled with NPCs who really brought that world to life. Some of these NPCs were just there for flavor text or lore, but some served more helpful positions, offering hints to lost players in order to nudge them along in the right direction. At a certain point in the game, the player would need to talk to Princess Sarah in order to obtain the loot key item, a task that was made a mandatory scripted event in all versions of the game following the WonderSwan Color release. Prior to this release, there was an NPC in Cornelia Castle who would give the hint to the player that they needed to talk to the princess if she had been rescued, but the player did not yet have the loot. In the original Famicom version though, this helpful line of dialogue was a little trickier to find, as the NPC that had it, due to a graphical bug, was invisible to the player. This was because whenever a player entered a room in the game, characters on the outside of the room would turn invisible and characters inside would become visible. In the Invisible Woman in Cornelia's case, this distinction was backwards by accident, hence her becoming invisible despite the Hero of Light still being able to interact with her. As mentioned, this mistake was clearly caught and corrected in subsequent versions through giving her dialogue to a different NPC and removing the necessity for a character with this hint altogether. But it remains as a curious one due to the fact that she clearly had an intended purpose and yet somehow slipped through the cracks only to spook vigilant players who searched every square of the castle for secrets and suddenly stumbled upon an NPC who was invisible. Not all Final Fantasy games left Japan during their original release cycle, and some would only reach players in the rest of the world much, much later. Chief amongst these was Final Fantasy III, which did not see a proper worldwide release until its remake on the Nintendo DS in 2006. In remaking the game, Square Enix and developer Matrix Software overhauled many aspects of the game, including graphics, music, and even some elements of the story. These were fleshed out and given new life, but unfortunately, in all the polishing for its Western debut, some story elements were left in a rather curious state. In the original game, the main characters were unnamed Onion Knights, avatars for the player, and 4 unnamed orphans destined to save the world. To make them more specific and memorable, in the DS remake, these characters were given names: Luneth, Ark, Refia, and Ingus, and in addition to personalities and dialogue, a new and expanded origin story was also created that tied in with Sid Hayes. And it was due to this new backstory that some timeline issues were introduced. After receiving the Wheel of Time from King Argus, the party returned to Sid in Canaan, who proceeded to tell them about their origins as orphans from the surface world. The story went that 10 years prior, while ferrying some denizens of the surface world about, a darkness engulfed the world and Sid's airship crash-landed onto the floating continent. This, however, seems to be in direct conflict with something Unai tells us later in the game. After waking her and questing for the 4 elemental fangs, Unai tells Luneth and the party about the origins of the floating continent and why the surface would lay shrouded in darkness. Specifically, she states it was actually 1,000 years ago that the darkness engulfed the world and froze time for all its people, a fact she claims to know as she spent every one of those years supposedly awake in the dream world. You could possibly try and explain this because time could have flowed differently for Sid and the Heroes of Light, as the world was covered in darkness, but that would still leave a lot of questions with regards to when exactly the floating continent was created and the nature of how the darkness works. In lieu of a solid canon answer, this discrepancy was probably just an adaptation error while attempting to build out the characters' backstories. Few projects in the greater Final Fantasy franchise are talked about in the same way as Square's first foray into the world of feature films, Final Fantasy The Spirits Within. As while the movie featured a star-studded cast and cutting-edge visuals, it was ultimately a flop with fans and at the box office. The main sticking points with the film seemed to stem from the complete disconnection between the movie and anything the series had done before. And while this was not unusual, as every Final Fantasy game was more or less unrelated to the previous, in the case of The Spirits Within, it proved a little too much for fans expecting something akin to what Advent Children would eventually become. Square, though, spent a lot of money making The Spirits Within, $137 million at the time, and for all the amount of detail they packed into the groundbreaking computer visuals, like all films, a couple of details still managed to slip through the cracks. One of the most glaring of these mistakes is made right at the start of the film when the Deep Ice Squad were staging their dramatic rescue of Dr. Aki in the ruins of New York City. Coming in on a transport ship, keen-eyed viewers will have noticed that 4 squad members leapt from the transport, but only 3 touched down. 3 squad members were then seen for the rest of the sequence until an encounter against some phantoms later on, where they were inexplicably 4 again. It seems that during the introduction to the Deep Ice Squad, one of the squad was meant to stay behind to pilot the transport, and the fact that only 3 members were seen for the majority of the scene will corroborate this fact. However, as one can tell from this gaffe, it seems that this little attention to detail was unfortunately overlooked. Few games could have boasted the aesthetic and general vibe that Final Fantasy X brought to the series upon its release in the early 2000s. Bringing a decidedly tropical feel with a matching soundtrack, the game simply had a mood that was wholly unique. Part of what made that mood was the game's stunning FMV sequences, which really showed off the power of the PlayStation 2. Bringing key story events to life, as similar sequences had done in Final Fantasy VII, 8 and 9, these showed off near photorealistic graphics and wowed players and critics the world over. For their part, these FMVs were made not using the in-game graphics and models of the game, but were instead rendered completely separately by a different team. While most of the time, this really didn't have too much of an effect on how these scenes were implemented in-game, occasionally this disconnect led to some rather strange mix-ups in continuity. For example, at the start of Final Fantasy X, after meeting Yuna for the first time in the Besaid Temple, the player was treated to a scene outside at night wherein multiple key characters at the time were hanging out by a fire with the residents of Besaid Village. Once Tidus went to bed after talking to Wakka, we clearly see him go to sleep in the Crusaders' Lounge on the west side of the town. After a brief dream sequence, Tidus was woken by the sound of Wakka talking to Lulu, whom we had also just met. An FMV would then play, showing Titus peeking out from behind a curtain and watching the scene, except that he suddenly seemed to have a vantage point of the conversation from Walker's hut instead. A hut which was located on the other side of the town. In fact, if you were to look closely, it would seem that you can even see the Crusaders' Lounge where Titus should have been in the background behind Lulu. Following the architecture of the Besaid Temple seen in this FMV, it's clear that the scene was rendered using the wrong vantage point, an error that was sure to slip by many in the moment, but in retrospect is quite funny. Another gaffe relating to Titus could be seen within the infamous laughing sequence. When Titus was teaching Yuna how to whistle, he showed her where to put her fingers in her mouth by demonstrating the exact placement himself while talking. But even though Titus didn't put his fingers in his mouth until right at the end of the dialogue sequence, James Arnold Taylor was directed to say the entire line as if his fingers were already there.
You try it too. Put your fingers in your mouth like this.
Like this?
Not like that. This. Then you just blow.
In the greater compendium of the compilation of Final Fantasy VII, Advent Children held the tricky position of being the first entry to tackle the fallout of the main story of the game. Seeking to make clashes between Cloud and the remnants of Sephiroth as epic as players imagined they would play out in real time, and with the best 3D modelling technology, Square pulled out all the stops and gave viewers all the physics-defying maneuvers and combat scenarios they could handle. While a lot of these scenes definitely required some extreme suspension of belief, the overall effect was mesmerizing and definitely made an impact. One scene in particular, the motorcycle chase between Cloud and the remnants of Sephiroth through Midgar, was especially eye-catching and gravity-rejecting. For this fact though, it's not the acrobatic inconsistencies we'd like to highlight, as those are more there for spectacle. But instead, what we're going to focus on is Cloud's weapons in the scene, specifically, how many he has. Earlier in the film, it was seen that Cloud's Fenrir motorcycle holds, in its frame, multiple swords, in addition to Cloud having a multiple sword sheath on his back. In the motorcycle chase, Cloud grabbed his main weapon with one hand on the Fenrir to engage Loz, with his other hand empty. Then, seconds later, suddenly he has two swords while deflecting bullets from Yazoo. He was then seen sheathing his extra sword, which was visible until the quartet entered the tunnel and Loz attacked from above, where Cloud seems to have no swords in his back sheath. At this point, the fight's becoming increasingly more hectic, and while it was seen that Cloud could combine his smaller swords together with his main sword, whether or not this was the case seemed to differ from shot to shot. When first engaging Loz in the tunnel, the second sword was initially not featured on his main weapon or person, only for it to seemingly appear from behind his back when Loz jumped off his bike. Cloud then appeared to both have at least one extra sword combined with his main weapon and one in his offhand while engaging Yazoo for a second time. After that, the sword count seemed to remain more or less consistent with Cloud combining them all together and then ejecting one to his offhand for the final part of the scene. It should be underlined that the whole scene does look absolutely awesome, but Cloud's newfound ability to manifest swords seemingly at will is definitely one of the more curious things to sneak its way into the movie. And that brings us on to our final entry, which sees us go from Advent Children all the way back to the original Final Fantasy VII, as we explore a little detail that not only made it into the final game, but is also quite humorous. That the Sister Ray is not only not aimed at the northern crater on the world map, but in fact isn't really aimed at the northern continent the crater is on. The Sister Ray was first seen in Junin when the party travelled there in hot pursuit of Sephiroth after leaving Midgar. After Shinra's attempt to use it defending Junin from Sapphire Weapon, it was then moved to Midgar in order to make use of the city's Mako reactors, with its new target none other than the northern crater itself. When Diamond Weapon began its advance towards Midgar, Cloud and his friends attempted to stop it, but were unsuccessful, leaving Midgar open to assault. Luckily for Midgar, the Sister Ray was able to do as it was intended, and destroyed both Diamond Weapon and the barrier surrounding the northern crater in a single shot. But it shouldn't have been possible, as when traced with the high wind, its line of fire was completely off. Given that the cannon does not appear to be very mobile, being so large and all, there's no real plausible explanation for this other than the developers simply orientating it incorrectly on the world map, and either just nobody noticed on the team, or they hoped that nobody else noticed. And with that last one, I think we're done. They were 7 mistakes you won't believe made it into Final Fantasy titles. Let us know in the comments which one you found the most interesting, as well as any mistakes or gaffes you noticed when playing Final Fantasy games. And if you enjoyed the video, give us a like and subscribe for more content. Alright everyone, this is Daryl signing out. I'd like to extend a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, The Livestream, Lord of Morning and Gregory, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.